Salamat, Nema. President Roman, colleagues, friends, I'm not the first speaker. That's Alan. I will introduce the panel. We titled our panel, The Promise of Redemption, for the simple reason that the task of education hinges on a promise that our students will learn with or despite us. In this season of promises, Alan, Cinch, Dina will examine why BESRA, a sound and promising plan for reform that went through stages of discussion and revision, has moved at a slow, rather frustrating pace. Here is a wonderful example of a good idea in place as the official agenda of the Department of Education, but apparently lacking vigor. The dynamics of transference from paper to reality is the subject of my three distinguished colleagues. One dimension of the gap between promise and performance is the information asymmetry that marks education. The fact that educators know ahead of everyone else what they will teach, while their students do not yet, and that the results of education become visible well after students have left school or university. Ours is not to exploit this asymmetry, but to mitigate it, in part by articulating a picture or vision, if you will, of what we think education ought to be in our country in this century. This I propose to do with regard to higher education, while my colleagues seek to breathe life into a solid reform agenda by going into the nuts and bolts of BESRA's implementation. I will reflect on higher education not to produce a HESRA, but to lay down the scaffolding for reform. So you face two scenarios this afternoon. One of a promise already made, and another about to take shape, albeit in silhouette form. Education means many things to many people, and not a few, parents and children, are drawn by the promise of income. But the commentary I recently came across presents graphs that show there is more to schooling than the financial payoff. The data refers to the US, where the study was done. The first shows you more education makes you happier. And the second, it makes you healthier. And it makes you more trusting. And finally, less likely to get divorced. I was telling the group, mabuti na lang, they didn't say anything about the likelihood of marriage. So with that, may I ask Alan to start this afternoon's conversation. Thank you.
Salamat, Maris. Good afternoon. When Maris highlighted the various positive consequences of being educated, she actually implicitly articulated what it means to be an educated person in the 21st century. Being an educated person can no longer be reduced to the basic 3 R's of reading, writing, and arithmetic. We are now living in a knowledge society where economic and social development and even personal well-being are largely based on the capacity to produce and to effectively utilize knowledge. Moreover, the knowledge demands of economic and social development are changing fast, as these are pressed forward by rapid developments in information and communication technology and globalization. And this also applies to an individual's personal and relational well-being, as Maris's data suggest that being more highly educated helps one find ways to be happily married, or if one chooses to be happily unmarried, in a society where everyone is trying to cope with demands of increasingly complex social arrangements. When what an educated person should know is changing every day, an education, it becomes more difficult to define what an educational system should be teaching all our students to learn. Clearly, the level of what is considered minimum functional knowledge today is several degrees higher than what it was a generation ago. Thus, it is important that our educational system not only meet the learning gaps relative to articulated learning goals and standards, our educational system should also articulate more current and updated learning goals and standards to allow the graduates of our schools to participate effectively in the knowledge society. In this regard, it does not make sense to push for simplistic back to the basics approaches to improving our educational system. Indeed, many school systems in different parts of the world have decided to revise their learning goals to more complex ones. Goals that emphasize the capacity to learn outside the formal school system and apply knowledge in real-life situations, and to the capacity to work with other people to promote personal and social development. Together with this collective thrust to revise the learning goals of the educational system, there is a recognition that different strategies are required to attain these goals for different types of students in different types of communities. There is a recognition that there is no one-size-fits-all educational experience that will make all students attain these more complex learning goals. Instead, there is an emphasis on experimenting with various types of teaching learning approaches and activities to determine what works best for specific learners in specific contexts and communities. Many of these reform themes have been articulated in important doctrines such as the UNESCO's 4 Pillars of Education, the discourses of education for all, and of lifelong learning. These ideas are also articulated in the DepEd's new definition of functional literacy for all Filipinos and in the Primer of Restructured Basic Education Curriculum, or RBEC. And this last point indicates to me that the Philippine basic education system is actually poised to engage these progressive global discourses of educational reform. The positive statement I just made may seem anomalous amidst the popular discourse of crisis in the Philippine educational system. But I strongly believe that there is good reason to be hopeful, and this hopefulness is shared by my colleagues in the panel. Our hopefulness is anchored on a reform framework that has been adopted by the Department of Education in 2005, called the Basic Education Sector Reform Agenda, or BESRA. But what exactly is the BESRA? The BESRA is a package of interrelated policy actions intended to bring about a fundamental change in how education is delivered across the basic education sector and in how reforms in the basic education sector are to be planned and implemented. The BESRA policy actions are organized under 5 key reform thrusts, or KRTs, that focus on strengthen school-based management, improve teaching effectiveness and teacher development, enhanced quality assurance through standards and assessment, improved access and learning outcomes through alternative learning systems, and so on, and institutional change, institutional culture change in the DepEd. The first KRT relates, I'm going to slow down because the PowerPoint is not as fast as my mouth. Okay. The first KRT relates to the reform principle that the best people to improve the quality of schools are the people most directly affected by the school's operations, namely the school heads, the teachers, the students' parents, and others in the community. There are 2 core ideas in the first KRT. First, the KRT assumes that the forces of change and improvement in education are not located at the highest level of the educational bureaucracy. Instead, the process of improving the quality of the educational system is located at the level of the school. This core idea has been referred to in different terms such as decentralization, the school's first initiative, or school-based management, and has actually been already legislated in the Governance of Basic Education Act of 2001, or RA 9155. Second, improving the quality of education is primarily assessed in terms of improved levels of school-wide student learning performance based on results of national standardized tests of student achievement.